So again, welcome to everybody, and thank you for joining today's webinar series. Today's topic is adoption of Prisma Access security capabilities. Of course, wanted to start off by reminding everybody of our webinar series. You should hopefully all be aware of our webinar series that we have going on. If not, please feel free to check them out at Live Community. There you can register for any upcoming sessions. We have a lot of great topics that we will be covering. You can take a quick glance of that, but of course you can access more on Live Community. Speaking of Live Community, so a quick reminder to everybody that, like I mentioned, we have a bunch of webinars on Live Community, not only existing webinars that we've pre-recorded, we also have a whole series of getting started. So if you're new to this, you can access a bunch of getting started videos that will help you on that journey. We have topics such as onboarding, mobile users, managing Prisma Access, and a bunch of more videos. Also, Live Community, not only does it has the recorded webinars and videos that we have there, but we also have a lot of great information for everybody. We've curated content based on where you're at on your journey, and there it can walk you through any questions you may have on that. We have information on Cloud Managed and Panorama Managed. We have access to our Prisma Access events calendar and more. And of course, we have links to a lot of useful Tech Docs articles. And of course, Tech Docs is where you can actually access a lot of great content. A lot of information that you see in a lot of our webinar series comes from Tech Docs. So please feel free to check it out. Look for some documents there that might be relevant to you. So a quick overview of what to expect in the next 60 minutes. We will start off by going over the cyber attack lifecycle. We will then be covering Prisma Access security capabilities. And of course, we will be ending today's session with a Q&A session. A quick reminder to enter your questions on the chat box, and we will make sure to address those towards the end of today's webinar series. And from here on, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Milan, who's going to be taking it on from here.
Thanks a lot, Wendy. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Milan, and I'll be talking about the security features of Prisma Access today and how to adopt them. In the first part, we'll be discussing about the cyber attack lifecycle. Cyber attack lifecycle is a framework used to enhance visibility into an attack and to improve our understanding of the adversary's tactics, techniques, and procedures. This particular framework was created by Lockheed Martin engineers all the way back in 2011. There are other frameworks available, so this is not the only way to look at the attack lifecycle. For example, MITRE ATT&CK is a very common one. There are several other frameworks. But for the purpose of today's discussion, we'll be able to work with the cyber attack lifecycle. The reason why we want to break the lifecycle into different phases is that we want to try to block the adversaries at any point so that we can break the chain of attack. Every attack starts with a reconnaissance phase. This is very similar to a physical attack or physical burglary. The way burglars and thieves think, they typically first start by carefully planning their attack. This typically means they will research, identify, and select their targets, often using phishing or extracting public information from employees' LinkedIn profile or similar public websites. if you translate this to say an example we all know, at least from the movies, like a bank robbery, typically somebody will first try to understand who is the target, when is the money inside of the bank, who are the guards, when do they change their shifts, what are their typical paths of patrol. So it's very similar with the cyber attack. The first phase is always gathering as much information as possible. It might seem a bit unimportant, the employee's LinkedIn profile or corporate websites, but it's actually very, very useful in terms of attackers. For example, they can find out who the important persons in a company are, who is the CEO, who is the CFO. So they can get some very important names, but this is all public information. Looking in deeper into LinkedIn, they can find different employees. From LinkedIn, they can learn which departments they work in, what are their positions, what are their roles inside of a company. So then if they want to try to extract more information or proceed with any further step of the attack, they can craft their attack much more precise based on all this information. And even furthermore, for example, if they look at the career openings for a particular company, they could find some open position in the IT department, which might list some desired skills, such as skilled with Cisco routers or skilled with Palo Alto firewalls. So they can typically, just by looking at the job openings, see what kind of technology that company is using to protect and to maintain their network. So there's quite a lot of information out there available in public. Apart from looking at the employees and the company itself, they will also try to scan the company's IP addresses and try to see if there's any open services or open applications. And then if any of those open applications could be running a vulnerable version of software. So how do we prevent the bad actors during the reconnaissance phase? The social engineering bit, we can block by blocking non-malicious URLs using URL filtering. So if, for example, they try to target a phishing attack against some of the employees and try to drive them to a bad site or try to drive them to a site they use for phishing, URL filtering can detect and block this. And when it comes to probing for vulnerability and scans, we can use vulnerability protection to detect and block these. In the second stage, after the reconnaissance is complete, the attackers will try to determine which methods to use to move forward. There's a lot of different methods available to them, and they will choose the one they think will have the highest rate of success. So that could be a seemingly innocuous file, for example, a PDF file or an Office document, or just a simple email message. And they might try to embed some code that the unsuspecting user might run. And this looks fairly innocent, but with a proper amount of preparation, this can be very, very precise spear phishing campaign where the email might look like it's coming directly from an employee superior or from a higher executive in the company, and will typically make people believe what they see and open attachments that they see and comply with whatever the request is in there. For highly targeted attacks, this may be something very specific, right? So if they have enough information, if they're targeting a single company or a single part of the company, rather than doing a wide network of attacks where they're just trying to breach whoever is vulnerable, they would be able to create a really, really specific targeted attack, which is simply targeted for one single person, something that hasn't been used before and is not widely seen on the internet. So how do we prevent them from sending over these weaponized delivery methods? The first thing we want to do is we want to provide visibility. This is the key. Using App ID and SSL decryption, we can gain visibility into the traffic that's coming in and out of the network. App ID can show which applications are being used, and SSL decryption can provide insight into encrypted traffic such as SSL or SSH. Once we have the visibility and once we know which applications are being used, regardless of the ports they're running on, we can block high-risk applications using app ID security policies. And this is a very important step because by blocking risky applications, we reduce the attack surface quite a bit. We definitely have some more fine-grained features for protection, but by simply blocking the applications that have no place in enterprise environment and that are high risk, we can reduce the attack surface by quite a bit right at the beginning. Moving on, if the attacker is using an application that's not typically considered to be high risk, an application that might as well just be web browsing or SMTP, we can use some other protection methods. For example, we can block malicious or risky websites such as hacking, phishing, malware, and many others using URL filtering. We can detect them and then we can block them. If there's different file types being transferred, we can block the risky ones using file blocking. For example, we can simply block all script files from email, or we can block any executable files from places where they should never appear. We can also block encrypted attachments or encrypted documents, which typically cannot be inspected because of the encryption that protects them. When it comes to exploits, we can block known exploits using vulnerability protection, which will detect exploit attempts and then block them if so configured. When it comes to file-based malware, we can block it using antivirus and wildfire signatures. So if we decided to allow executables using file blocking, and if the executable comes from a trusted website, we can still apply antivirus and wildfire signatures and detect bad files inside of otherwise trusted connections. If the file is not previously known, we can still block it using wildfire inline machine learning. This is a very important feature because it allows us to block files for which we still don't have signatures because they're still not known to Palo Alto networks. So even if the file is unknown, so for example, a zero-day piece of malware that has not been seen by any security researcher anywhere in the world, can still be detected and blocked using inline machine learning from Wildfire. And then last but not the least, if the file is completely unknown, does not trigger any of the protections we've seen so far, the file can be sent to the Wildfire cloud for a cloud sandbox malware analysis. And then if we determine that the file is bad, we can automatically deliver protections across all these features using Wildfire Cloud. So for example, if we detect that after sandbox analysis that the file is bad, we can block the URL from which the file came from. We can block some other command and control host that it has contacted, and we can create signatures that will block that and similar files from being downloaded further on. So if this step is successful, if this step in the chain is successful and the attacker is able to deliver their weaponized payload onto the target endpoint, that means they need to make the user activate the code. They need to activate the code on the endpoint. There's different ways to do this. As I mentioned, it could be as simple as telling the user, hey, please open this attachment. And that attachment could be either an Office file with some scripting, or maybe a hidden executable file, which looks like a document. And it could require user interaction for the code to be executed. But also more sophisticated, the file that gets over could be exploiting some piece of software that's running on the endpoint. For example, if that's a user that received a PDF file or downloaded a PDF file, they might be opening it in Adobe Reader, and the PDF file might be trying to exploit the vulnerability in the Adobe Reader. Or if it's a, let's say, web server or some other application server, it could be trying to exploit that service itself, right? So definitely targeting the vulnerability on the software side rather than trying to trick the user into running something. But in any event, the goal of the attacker is to activate their code on the target endpoint. So how do we stop this? This is something that's basically impossible to stop with, let's say, network-based security systems, because at this point, the malware code, the weaponized payload, is already on the endpoint. So it has gone through already one layer, at least one layer of protection, and it has ended up on the endpoint. And this step, so the exploitation, happens on the endpoint itself. So there's no network activity at this point. It's either tricking the user or tricking the software into running the attacker's code. What we can do here, we can use Cortex XDR, which is a software product from Palo Alto Networks, which runs on the endpoints and blocks known and unknown vulnerability exploits and malware. What this means is that apart from using wildfire and signatures and machine learning to block virus files, it can also block both known and unknown vulnerability exploits because it targets the exploitation methods rather than particular exploits. So even if it's a zero-day vulnerability, even if we've never seen it before, if there's an exploitation attempt on the endpoint, Cortex XDR can detect it. So may that be stack smashing or knob sleds or heap spraying, all these methods that exploits use regardless of which piece of software they're targeting, Cortex XDR is able to detect and stop this on the endpoint itself. If that succeeds, so if the attacker is able to have their code running on the endpoint, the next thing they will try to do is they will try to establish privilege operations, so a root in Unix-based systems or administrator in Windows-based systems. They will try to escalate their privileges, and they will try to establish their persistence and hide their presence. The reason why persistence is typically important for an attacker is they've gone through all this trouble. They've done their homework, they've done their research, they've created the payload, they've sent the payload over, they were able to trick the user of software into executing their code. So their code is now running. But what happens if the system reboots? User goes home, shuts down their laptop, and then powers it again. Everything is lost. Memory is erased. Everything starts from the beginning, and the attacker's code is no longer there. So it's very important for the attacker code, once it's running, to make itself persistent so that it runs the next time the user logs in or the next time the computer reboots. So they will typically try to, in Windows, for example, install themselves into a registry key that's responsible for running programs on startup or some similar methods. When it comes to escalating privileges, this is also an important step. Typically on an endpoint as a limited user, they have limited abilities of what they can do. Whereas if they had admin privileges, they could potentially infect other users on that machine, other software running on that machine. And then as an elevated user, they could possibly dump the memory to get the clear text passwords or certificates or other attacks based on that. So they will also try to see if there's any ways on the local machine that they can use, typically by exploitation, to elevate their privileges from regular user to administrator user. And then last but not the least, they will try to install a rootkit, which typically hides their presence. For example, if the way the malware works is they run a process and store the contents of their code in an executable file, the rootkit will try to hide this. So if you look at the list of processes in the system, you do not see this process. If you look at the list of files in a folder, you do not see this file because the rootkit will typically interfere with the operating system kernel and try to intercept all the calls that would show the presence of this process or the file and hide it on the system so it's not visible to external users. So how do we prevent this? Again, this is something that happens entirely on the endpoint. So there is no network activity at this point yet. The entire activity is on the host machine. So again, in order to prevent local exploitation that's used for privilege escalation or password theft, we can use Cortex XDR, which also prevents malware from accessing certain operating system functions. And if the malware is unknown, Cortex XDR can send samples of those unknown executables to Wildfire for further analysis and to create additional protections. So for example, if the file ended up on the endpoint or if the file was created on the endpoint, we can still learn about the file, about its presence, and about what the executable does, and create protections on both the endpoint and the network level based on that using Wildfire. Okay, if this was successful as well, what the attackers typically want to do is establish a command and control channel back to them. The reason for this is multiple. So first, they want to know if their attack succeeded, right? So if there was no command and control, they might not know if their code is running on the endpoint or not. This way, if there is command and control, they will know if the attack was successful, and they will be able to send further commands down to their malware, down to the infected devices, based on their end goals. Historically, this used to be a connection that comes from the outside, right? So from whichever way, from whichever place the attacker was located, they would try to make another connection to the infected host, where the malware would be listening on a particular port. But that doesn't happen anymore. The command and control channels most often are reversed. So they attack a machine, and then the infected machine will communicate back and initiate connection back to the attacker servers. This is very important for them because once they get the command channel back, they can control what that endpoint does. This is also a very important step in the chain, a link in the chain that we definitely want to stop, because even here, they have their code running, it's persistent, it's hidden. If we detect the command and control traffic, we know that a host is infected. And if we prevent it, then the attacker doesn't know that it's infected, and the attacker cannot send any further commands. So even though it seems like it's very late in the attack cycle, it is still very important to detect and block command and control events. We can block it. We can block outbound command and control communications using anti-spyware pattern signatures. The anti-spyware pattern signatures will look in the traffic patterns. So we'll look into the traffic itself and try to see if the traffic pattern inside a particular session matches known malware behavior when it comes to command and control. Another feature we use here is DNS security and DNS signatures, which are configured as part of anti-spyware profiles, which look into the DNS queries made by endpoints and try to detect if they are using domains that are known to be used for command and control. So these two features work in concert. The spyware looks into patterns, so looks into the traffic itself, and does not depend on the actual domains. So if an attacker quickly switches domains, we still look at the patterns. Whereas on the other hand, DNS security does not rely on the pattern of the actual traffic, which could be HTTP or even IRC or some custom protocol. It looks at DNS queries and looks at DNS domains inside DNS queries. So together, these two features make a really strong anti-spyware component. But DNS sync is an additional feature which works in concert with DNS security and the DNS signatures. What DNS sync does is when it detects a bad domain being used in a query, instead of dropping the query, it will return a specified honeypot IP to the host instead of just dropping the request. This is very useful when we have hosts that do DNS via some channel that's not directly visible to Prisma Access. For example, in a remote network, there could be a host that's using a local DNS server, and then the local DNS server will go out to the internet and resolve the queries. So if we would detect such a packet, the source IP would be the IP of the DNS server, the local DNS server. And we do not know which host is really making that request, which host is really infected. And that is very, very valuable information. So if we use DNS sync, we would instead return a honeypot IP, and then the infected host would reach out to the honeypot IP in order to try to make that command and control connection. And then we can detect this connection because it's a proper TCP or UDP connection that goes out, and we will see the real infected host source IP and not the DNS server. If the attackers are using HTTP or HTTPS for this, and this is a very common case, we can block it using URL filtering. So even if the DNS didn't trigger or the patterns didn't trigger, if we see suspicious URLs, we can block them with URL filtering. And last but not the least, if the attacker is using some unknown apps or novel attack techniques that don't use any of the existing protocols and applications, we can still detect it, because App ID can detect applications that it doesn't recognize and mark them as unknown TCP and unknown UDP. So if it's an application we have never seen before and we cannot recognize, it's marked as unknown, and this is something you can block. So if we don't know what's going on, we can block it, and that's the secure way. Okay, the last step is actions at the objective. This really depends on what is the original purpose of the attack. Sometimes the purpose might be just to cause damage. So they might just want to delete or make services unavailable. Very common today is ransom. So they might want to encrypt files and ask for a ransom. But then they could also want to spread throughout the network, because once they're inside the network, it's typically easier to hop from host to host than coming again from the outside. Could be as simple as defacing a website. This used to be very popular. It really depends on what the attacker is trying to do. Could be intellectual property theft. So they might be looking to exfiltrate data, sensitive data about people, maybe source code for applications, business data. That can be a lot of different objectives. So how do we prevent this? We can use file blocking and data filtering, or DLP, to prevent sensitive uploads. As I mentioned with file blocking, we can see, for example, that documents should not be going out from DMS or document management server to the internet. If that's an internal site, sensitive files or PDFs should never be going out from that place into the internet. So we can use file blocking to block file types that should not be going from one zone to another, where they normally would not want to see them. And then data filtering or DLP service can be much more fine-grained. So rather than looking at the file type, we can look at the contents. For example, we could be checking if the contents of the files contain social security numbers or other personal identification numbers, or maybe some sensitive data, addresses or credit card numbers or something like that. So not just looking at simply at the file type, we could be looking if some specific sensitive data is actually traversing a boundary it shouldn't. And then, of course, if they are trying to transfer those files into a non-bad place, we can always block that through filtering. Lateral movement, I mentioned it really briefly, is when an attacker compromises one asset within a network and then tries to move from there to other hosts within the same network. As I mentioned, the reason why they would want to do that, because it's typically easier to move inside of a network, because the protection is typically applied on the boundaries, for example, on the internet edge or remote access services. This is where typically the protection lies. And once you're inside of, say, a data center or an office, you can typically move more freely, because now the source of the attack, which would be the compromised endpoint, is typically considered trusted. This is not specifically covered by the Lockheed Martin kill chain, but it's still an important segment that's worth discussing. So what can we do to stop that? Zero trust really is the answer here. So we should never consider that internal hosts are trusted. There's many ways why they might not be trusted, because it could be compromised, as is in the example we've been talking about. It could be a disgruntled employee. It could be an employee that infected their machine while taking the laptop home and plugging it into maybe insecure internet cafe, or it can be even in some cases espionage, where I'm sure you've seen in the news, there was a Tesla employee that received an offer for a very high amount of money to install malware inside Tesla's network. And yeah, I believe it was $1 million or several $1 million. It's just something that's this user reported to Tesla, which is great, but some other user might not have done so, right? Might have taken the offer and actually installed malicious software on their laptop, which they would then bring into the corporate network. So in that case, something that's typically considered trusted, all of a sudden becomes untrusted and source of an attack. And the only way to stop this is to adopt a zero trust model. And the best way to do it is to establish secure zones where the access will be strictly enforced and controlled with next generation firewalls or global protect, and then monitor and inspect this traffic between zones. So basically east-west traffic from users into the data center, traffic between different zones in the data centers, etc. So traffic that does not necessarily come from the internet, the traffic that you would normally consider trusted. And then once you have the firewalls and the zones in place, or global protect, once the traffic between these zones is being inspected, then we can use the same methods that we've discussed so far in weaponization, delivery prevention. So we can use the same methods to detect the attackers spreading the malware laterally, trying to exploit, scan the internal network, etc., etc. Okay, that was everything I wanted to talk about today. I want to mention that next week on Wednesday, there will be a Cloud Managed Prisma Access webinar regarding onboarding the remote workforce, Cloud Protect, and Okio. And on March 17th, so next Thursday, we will be continuing this talk about security capabilities, where I'll be zooming into each of these security features and talking about the best practices on how to best apply and use each of these security features. And with that, I would like to open it up for Q&A. Please use the chat function to ask questions.
Great, thank you. I'm going over the questions. I don't see any questions right now, but like Milan said, please feel free to ask any questions on the chat box. And a quick reminder to everybody that if you have any questions that come up after the webinar, please feel free to email us at networksecuritycs@Palo Alto Networks. There we can answer any of your questions that may come on after today's webinar. So again, networksecuritycs@paloaltonetworks.com. I don't see any questions, so I will assume that there's no questions for today. Also a reminder to please fill out the post-webinar survey. It's very important for us to understand how you're feeling about these webinars, especially understanding what topics you would like us to cover. We have an entire series going on, but of course we want to make sure that we cover anything that you may want us to cover, and any feedback would be very appreciated. All right, well, thank you so much, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We'll see you guys next week. Thank you.